This week on the podcast, Colin Blunstone. Now, he was the lead vocalist of the iconic British rock band, The Zombies, and Colin's distinctive, breathy voice was heard on hits like She's Not There and Time of the Season. And he also enjoyed a successful solo career with songs like Say You Don't Mind. And today, he continues to tour.
Most bands of that era have got nightmare stories to tell. It's not just us. It's not a sob story. We all got together on a sort of Easter Saturday in St. Albans, and that was the Zombies. He just heard me and he said, "I'll tell you what, if you'll be the singer, I'll play keyboards." And this guy is screaming, really, really bad language, screaming down the headphones at this 18-year-old boy. And I was thinking, you know what? I don't think the music business is for me. This is ridiculous. A path opened up for us. It could have been completely different if we hadn't recorded She's Not There. We bought a van. We got that far. But where we would have driven the van to, I'm not quite sure. Everybody lost interest in the UK. In America, She's Not There was hit slightly later. It was 3 months later. So they skipped that follow-up, Leave Me Be, and put out the next record, which was Tell Her No. And that was another top 5 single. Music business keeps you on your toes, I can tell you.
Don't go away. The interview with Colin is coming up. Just time for me to ask you to like, comment, subscribe, and even take out a membership. By taking out a membership, you support me in continuing the podcast. Okay, let's get to the interview with Colin Blunstone. So, Colin Blunstone, welcome. This is an immense privilege to have someone with an amazing history like you on my podcast. So thank you for joining me. You come from a generation, if I may say, that although September the 2nd or 1945 was the end of the Second World War, the war in Europe had ended in May, and a month later, you were born. So you are actually a post-war child.
That's right. Yeah, I was very aware of that when I was younger, that the war in Europe had ended. Family conversations were very often focused on wartime exploits and deprivations and so forth. So, I was very aware that I was born right at the end of the Second World War.
What do you think that my parents were obviously wartime parents as well, but what do you feel of having parents so immediately after this had happened, the war had happened, had changed that sort of your generation? What did they change and install in you?
Well, I think they probably wanted, like most parents, they wanted better for their children than they'd had. And I mean, I was an only child, and my parents were absolutely devoted and wonderful parents. And I think that having gone through that deprivation that they'd been through in the Second World War, and after the war, of course, there was still food rationing and petrol rationing and so forth. I think they very much wanted a better world for their children.
And also it was a period because creativity, it didn't stop obviously during the war, but there wasn't the freedoms that we have today, in a sense, particularly when it comes to music, come from that generation after the Second World War. And I just wondered what sort of music you were brought up with as a child. What did your parents listen to?
Well, I don't think we listened to a lot of music at home, particularly, like records and things like that. But my mother had 5 brothers who were all musicians, very good musicians as well. Most of them played 2 or 3 instruments. All of them played 2, some of them played 3. And so I spent a lot of time at my grandmother's house, and I was listening to them playing live a lot. Of course, they were in dance bands, not rock bands in those days, but also they were very good harmony singers as well. So it made a huge impression on me. I probably wasn't aware of it so much at the time, but looking back, I realized it did make a huge impression on me.
I mean, when I was young, music provided an escape from my life. I mean, I think not that my life was terrible or anything, but it provided an escape into another world. Did listening to music provide, from your uncles, provide an escape for you into a different world?
Not so much. No, I mean, you have to remember that in 1945, people might have a few old 78 records. There were no 45 records then. There was no online music. It was quite rare, unless someone actually played music. And there was not a lot of music that appealed to me on the radio. It was all sort of light orchestral music on the radio, and it didn't really appeal to me, I'm afraid. So I wasn't really interested. I wasn't really that interested in music until the late 50s. So I would have been about 10 or 11. And when I first heard people like Elvis, Chuck Berry, Little Richard, and heaven knows where I heard them, because there wasn't a lot of recorded music on the radio. But I can remember just hearing them at fairgrounds, and there was an old lorry driver's cafe near me, and with a pal, I'd often go up there and have a coffee or a tea, and they had a jukebox, and we used to listen to these rock classics. And that's when I really got interested in music. I think I quite liked music, but it was then with the early greats of rock and roll that I was just fascinated by it. And then, of course, later on came Buddy Holly, and a particular favorite of mine was Ricky Nelson. And by the time Ricky Nelson arrived, I was fascinated and fully committed to music.
Did that trigger, to seeing these bands, did that trigger you to get a guitar?
It did. Yes. We weren't a particularly well-off family. My father very kindly bought me an acoustic guitar. It was an East German guitar called a Framus, and it was a Framus Atlantis. And we lived in North London, in Hatfield, which is about 30 miles north of London. And I remember that there was a Bell's accordion shop. I don't know why accordions, that's probably how it started up. And it was in Surbiton, which was quite a drive for us to come down to southwest London. And that's what we did. We came down, and Bell's Accordions used to advertise in the national press, and they had hundreds of guitars there. And we came down and bought a guitar from them, and it was about £12. That was a lot of money for my parents to fork out. And my dad was very worried, concerned that it would be a 3-day wonder. But, I'm still playing guitar now. And that guitar recently ended up in a museum, because it was the guitar that I played when the Zombies started. I think he's no longer around, but I think he would have been absolutely thrilled that that guitar got a certain degree of recognition that we bought that day in Surbiton.
How did you feel about playing the guitar? Because in a sense, I mean, it's seen in a few ways. One is an extension, almost like a phallic extension. And the other way is a sort of way of protection. If you're playing an instrument, it's almost somehow a defense. You're a different person. So what did the guitar feel like for you? And did it make you more attractive?
I don't think so. Not at 12. It was. I only ever played when I was alone in my bedroom. So I don't think any of those alternatives were very relevant when I first started playing guitar. But of course, when you join a band, I think whether it's a conscious feeling or a subconscious feeling, you are aware that there's a chance you will meet girls in a way that perhaps you wouldn't do if you weren't in a band. And that is probably at the back of most musicians' minds when they join a band. Not so much when you first get a guitar. I think I loved singing. Not that long ago, one of my old neighbours who I hadn't seen for years said to me, before we knew your name, we used to call you the boy who sings. And it just reminded me that I used to, just walking along the street, I wasn't, thinking I'd ever be a professional singer, but I just used to sing all the time. And so when I got a guitar, of course, that gave me another dimension to my solo performances in front of absolutely no one. And that's, what I enjoyed doing. I was just very lucky. I went to a school in St. Albans, and it was a strict school. We had to sit in alphabetical order, no choice. So the guy in front of me was called Paul Arnold, A, Colin Blunstone, B. And he knew a boy in the next row to him. This is how bands get together. It's so by chance, you know. At the next row to him, wasn't in our school. There's no way I could have known this guy. Paul Arnold sat in front of me, and he knew Rod Argent, who lived in the next row to him. And Rod had decided he really wanted to put a band together. And Paul he was his pal, but on top of that, he'd made a bass guitar in woodwork. He'd never played one, but he'd made it. That got him into the band. And then Paul Arnold said to me, "You've got a guitar, haven't you?" And I said the fatal words, "Yes." And I think I said it, "Yes." I'm thinking, what's coming next? And he said, "Well, do you want to be in a band?" And I'd spoken to him about being in the band so many times. To be honest, when he said that, I thought, oh, God, how am I going to be in a band? You know, I've got all these sport things I'm supposed to do after school. Where am I going to find time? But I talked about a band so many times. There was no wriggle room, you know. I had to say yes. And I only say that because a lot of people will say they were driven to be on stage. They had to be on stage, you know. But it wasn't quite like that for me. Opportunity came knocking, so to speak. And we all got together on a sort of Easter Saturday in St. Albans, and that was the Zombies.
It's interesting, though, because Rod seems the one who was determined.
Oh, yes, he was.
That he had a band, yeah.
Yes, and also, well, I always felt it was very much his band. He was the leader, he was the driving force. He was really the main writer, arranger. It was definitely focused around him. And his interest came, I think, because he'd been very interested in music anyway, and he was in the cathedral choir. So he had a very good understanding of harmonies, and we were always a harmony band, which was quite unusual in 1961. Most people wanted to be the Shadows or something, you know, something like that. But we were always a harmony band. He actually taught himself to play piano, although in later life, he also taught himself to read music as well. And he made a wonderful classical album called Classically Speaking, which is stunning. I do recommend it to you. Yeah, but it was very much Rod's band. And his cousin, Jim Rodford, who later on for 20 years was in the Kinks, he was in the big local band at the time called the Blue Tones. I know there's a modern Blue Tones. This is Blue Tones in St. Albans. And Rod went along to see his cousin, Jim Rodford, play in the Blue Tones, and he was just knocked out. And he thought there and then, I mean, well, he was 14 or 15. And he said, "I've got to put a band together." And Rod's a very determined guy, and he's a very tenacious guy. And he just set around about putting a band together in slightly unorthodox ways, really, because they had an Army Corps band at his school. I didn't go to the same school. And they had drummers at the front. And he watched them marching once, and he chose the best side drummer in the core band, and that was Hugh Grundy. And he became the drummer in the Zombies. He'd never played a full kit. Remember, we were still at school. We were 15 years old. He'd never played a full kit. There was a folk club at his school, and he thought the best guitarist in the folk club was Paul Atkinson. And he became our guitarist. Paul Arnold became our bass player because he'd made a bass in woodwork. And originally I was going to be the rhythm guitarist because I had a guitar and I sat behind Paul Arnold at school. So it was thrown together in quite a strange way, and it just amazes me that was the Zombies. Paul Arnold, who sat in front of me, wanted to become a doctor, and he decided his studies wouldn't allow him to rehearse in the way that we needed to. So he left after about a year or 18 months, and Chris White took his place, and he went on to be one of the main writers in the Zombies. That was the only change that happened in the original Zombies, and it all came together quite by chance.
Did he give you some form of audition or make you sing something to prove to him that you could sing?
Well, it was strange, really, because I joined as a rhythm guitarist, and at that first rehearsal, Rob was going to be the singer. And what happened, he went over to a broken down old piano in the corner that was only there by chance. I'd only just met him. I didn't know he played the piano. And he played Nut Rocker by B. Bumble and the Stingers. And if you've ever heard that, it's a sort of a rock and roll take on a classical piece. I knew immediately, anyone would know that he was in a completely different class to us. You know, we were 15-year-old amateurs finding our way very early on in our careers. And I went over to him. As I said, I didn't really know him. And I said, you really should play keyboards in this band. But he was adamant in his mind. He wanted it to be a rock band, and a rock band with 3 guitars, lead guitar, rhythm guitar, me, and bass guitar, and he would be the singer. And in this first rehearsal, we'd only played an instrumental. So Rod hadn't done anything except in the coffee break, played the piano for 3 or 4 minutes. So we were still 3 guitars and Rod being a singer until the end of the first rehearsal. And because I'm the boy who sings, as I was putting my guitar away, I just started a Ricky Nelson song and I just sang to myself, just to myself. And he said he picked up on that. So it wasn't, it wasn't really an audition. He just heard me and he said, "I'll tell you what, if you'll be the singer, I'll play keyboards." And essentially that was the Zombies.
Oh, that's amazing. I think that when you start a band, there's always different visions from the individual members of what they may want out of it. When did the point come for you that you saw it as a possible serious, venture where you may actually be successful at some point?
I can remember the moment very vividly. I could probably research the date for you because we won a big rock and roll competition, had a rather strange name. It was, because we were in Hertfordshire, it was called the Hearts Beat Competition. And it was at Watford Town Hall in front of 2,000 people, which was a lot for us. And we won it. And you had to win the heat. There were 10 bands a night, and it went on for 10 Sundays. So there were 100 bands went in for it. And we won our heat, which we were really surprised we won the heat, And then we won the final. And I can remember thinking, we all went for drinks at someone's house afterwards. And I remember I didn't say anything, but I was thinking to myself, wow, dare I think that there could be a way forward, that we could become a professional band. And I think possibly we were all thinking along those lines, because we decided, not that night, but we decided over the next few weeks that we would try to be a professional band. We didn't know exactly what you had to do or what would happen. But during that process, we had our first recording session. And during that session, we recorded She's Not There. And that was immediately a hit in this country. And about 3 months later, it was a big hit. It was a bigger hit in the States, actually. And so a path opened up for us. It could have been completely different if we hadn't recorded She's Not There. We bought a van. We got that far. But where we would have driven the van to, I'm not quite sure. Or how we would have got any gigs, I don't know. I think She's Not There came about by chance. We'd been introduced to a producer called Ken Jones, and he was giving us a bit of a pep talk before our first session in Decca Studios. And I think we were only going to record a single. And during the pep talk, he said, well, the session's in a couple of weeks' time. You could always write something for it. And then went on and talked about other things. Now, we were a band who were trying to develop as a rhythm and blues band. That's what at one time the Zombies were called, the Zombies R&B, because that's the kind of music that we played. And no one had thought about writing original music until our producer, Ken Jones, said that. And Rod and Chris White immediately went away. And over the next couple of days, Rod wrote She's Not There, and Chris wrote, Yeah, You Make Me Feel Good, which was the B-side. And I think we all knew immediately that both of those songs were very special. I had no idea they could write songs. It was a huge surprise to me. And of course, they were 2 of the songs that we recorded in the first session. We recorded 4 songs, actually. Another song by Rod called It's All Right by Me, or something like that. You Make Me Feel Good, which was the B-side, She's Not There. And we also recorded Gershwin's Summertime, because we'd sung that as quite a feature of our act at that time. And we still play that now. So those 4 songs were all recorded in one evening.
I mean, before that competition, you had been playing together regularly, hadn't you, for about a year, I think. I think it was quite a long time. How much do you set the value of that experience of gelling and coming together as a group in terms of your later success?
Well, I think the longer you can play together and the more you can play together, the tighter you become as a unit. So I mean, it's invaluable to spend some time, you know, learning your craft. I wish in a way we'd had longer. Nearly all the other bands of that time played the club scene around London, or Liverpool, or Birmingham, or Manchester. But I mean, the bands that I knew more about would play around London. They played the Marquee and Kloop's Cleek and Eel Pie Island, and places that there was a whole circuit. And we missed out on that. So it was great that we were together from 61 to 64. We were only playing at weekends, and often that might only be a Saturday, and then we'd rehearse on a Sunday. But we were together for some time, and hopefully we were quite tight as a band. But I don't think we had any stagecraft or understood anything about the business. If things have come a little bit later, it doesn't matter. You look back and think, oh, if only it would have been better. It's irrelevant because it's gone. But it might have been better for us if we'd have had a year or so playing the clubs like the Stones did, Yardbirds, Georgie Fame, all the bands of that, Brian Auger, all the bands of that era played the London clubs, and we didn't.
Ken Jones was a big film and music producer or over the years. And
yes,
I mean, that was quite a prize, but for him, it must have been also an amazing prize when someone comes in with She's Not There and he hears this track. It's sort of a track that you feel there's no doubt this is going to be a massive success. I say that in retrospect, of course.
I think he knew it was a really good song. I'm sure he did. Anyone would know that that's a good song. But there are so many things that go into a song becoming a hit. So many indefinable things. You know, you need a bit of luck. You need a good record company that believes in it, good promotion people, marketing. All those things have to be there. And maybe it has to be the right time as well. That song, if it had been 2 years earlier or 4 years later, maybe it wouldn't have been so successful. But I'm sure he knew it was a good song. Absolutely.
Sorry, I'm in Athens, and you often hear the traffic and everything go by, but it's just part of the.
Sorry, where are you? Athens?
Yeah. So it's
really? All right. Excellent.
You know, you mentioned you were very young. You were actually 18, I think, at that time. If I think of the 18-year-old me, and you know, we haven't got that much difference in years, but each generation gets older when they're younger, if you see what I mean. They're like, you know, they seem to be more grown
matures
up.
Earlier.
Yeah, exactly. And you know, there you are, you're not in the center of London, you're not around other bands or other musicians who may in a sense be able to advise you about how to do things. How do you feel that naivety played into the decisions that you were later to make as a band that may have affected your career in a negative way?
Well, I mean, I think it's well known that the music business is quite a testing environment. And of course, we made many, many mistakes. And they resulted in, amongst other things, well, you know, I can think of so many different paths we could have chosen that might have been for the better. But then I often think, you know, there's 100 roads in front of you that are all wrong. And there's probably just one or two that are the right path. So it's inevitable. You're going to go off on a wild goose chase, or, you know, every so often. And we certainly did. And I mean, one regret is that apart from the songwriters, because they had a completely different income stream that came from a different setup, and they were treated very fairly. But as a band, as a touring band, I think if we'd had more experience, the financial side of things might have been a bit better. Most bands of that era have got nightmare stories to tell. It's not just us. It's not a sob story. It's a rite of passage that you come into this business and you get trampled on by more experienced people, and that's what happened to us, really, and that's one of the reasons I think why the band finished when it did, because the three non-writers were totally broke. And musicians are very resourceful. They can exist on very little, but it just came to the point where it was very difficult, and particularly for Paul Atkinson, our guitarist, because he just got married, and so his lifestyle and the demands on his finances were very different, because he was now married, and he probably, from memory, he was the first one to say, guys, I can't go on like this. I haven't got any money and I'm married. And Paul also was very bright, and he'd been offered a great job in a very early computing firm, which I am sure paid certainly paid more than he was making in the Zombies, I'm sure. And so he decided he had to make that choice, and I don't blame him at all. I think he made the right choice. But of course, later on, he rejoined the music industry as an A&R man for CBS, and amongst other artists, he signed. I was blank on names. Who was the band that did Mamma Mia? The Swedish band.
Abba.
Sorry, I'm sorry to all ABBA fans. It might be old age. I just forget names. But he signed ABBA in the UK. He went out. It was at Brighton, the Eurovision Song Competition, and he went down there and he signed ABBA. And he tried. It was for CBS, who are now Sony, and he tried to get the American company to sign them. And I think they put out a couple of singles, but they never gave them a proper album deal over there. And I once said to Paul, "How much do you think that cost them?" And he said, "Well, about 20 million." I'm talking about 20 or 30 years ago when I asked him that question. I dread to think what it cost him. But yeah, Paul Atkinson signed ABBA and a lot of other artists as well. He went on to be a very, very successful music business executive.
See, the decisions are always right in the end, probably. I just want to ask you one more question about She's Not There, because Gus Dudgeon was involved. Now, he became, a massive producer of Elton John. He had a very forceful personality. First of all, how did he actually get involved, and how was he? Because he's got a sort of reputation of having a very strong vision that he puts through what he wants. But there, he was a lot younger. More of Colin Blunstone to come, of course, but just time for me to give my regular spiel and ask you to like, subscribe, comment, and maybe take out a membership. A membership really helps me continue with the podcast. And obviously, I do this for love, but it would be good to also do it for a bit of money. So please help me with the membership. It's only, small amounts. And it does really help me continue with this podcast. Okay, let's get back to Colin Blunstone. He's got a sort of reputation of having a very strong vision that he puts through what he wants. But there, he was a lot younger.
He was a lot younger. I actually worked with Gus later, 10 years later. And I did experience a little bit of what you're talking about. Bless him. Obviously, he's no longer with us. But yeah, he was a wonderful producer, and he had very definite ideas. But what we're talking about, I'll tell you the whole story. We'd been booked in to record in the evening because it was felt in those days that if you recorded through the night, it was a better time to be recording. I don't think anyone thinks like that now. Everyone records in the daytime, but our session started at 7. And unfortunately, because it was a late start, the engineer we had, who was a really good engineer, he'd engineered a lot of hit records. He'd been at a wedding all day, and he was horrifically drunk, really badly drunk, and very aggressive. And so when we started doing vocals early on, I've got the headphones on, and this guy is screaming, really, really bad language, screaming down the headphones at this 18-year-old boy. And I was thinking, you know what? I don't think the music business is for me. This is ridiculous. But then we had a bit of luck, and he passed out. He passed out cold on the floor. And we carried him out 3 flights of stairs and put him in a black London taxi. And I never saw him again. I hope he got home all right. And the assistant engineer had to take over. And it was his first session ever. And it was Gus Dudgeon. And he always remembered the Zombies was his first session. And Gus Dudgeon engineered our first session. So that, you know, I always remembered that. And he always remembered it too. But, you know, another chance thing.
So you were nearly not the Zombies, weren't you? There was some great names.
I know. Oh, we were nearly not. We were absolutely. You know, it's almost a bit embarrassing actually when you're a band and you've got to sit there trying to think of a name that's, you know, that's memorable, cool. Very important to be cool when you're 18, and you're going through all these names that everyone says no. There's already a band called that. There's already a band called that, and I think the first name we had, it was only for a week or so. We were the Mustangs for a week or so, and we realised there was certainly there was one other band called the Mustangs. There were probably many, and then to my eternal shame, I came up with another name. It was the name of an Australian film.
It was a brilliant film. That was the Sundowners with Robert Mitchum, Deborah Kerr, Peter Ustinov. Fantastic film.
Yes, I remember seeing the film, and you saved me. You saved me there. This is my bad thing with names. It was the Sundowners, and that was my idea. That actually only lasted for 2 or 3 days. I don't think anybody really liked that. And then Paul Arnold, the only guy that was ever allowed to leave the Zombies, he came up with the name The Zombies. And I have to admit that at the time, I didn't really know what a zombie was. Still not all that sure what a zombie is. But it was catchy and it's sort of stuck. And everyone in the band really liked it, probably except me. I was probably still a bit stung that we hadn't kept the Sundowners, as that had been my idea. I say that with a smile on my face. I didn't mind at all. But yeah, he came up with the idea of the Zombies, and it just stuck. I mean, but there's no deep meaning, no real story. It came out of desperation. We were desperate for a name, and he just came up with this name.
Things seem to have happened really quickly, and there, you know, you go from that, and suddenly you're in the States, and you're playing in the States. Now, for me, you know, at that age, going to the States, you have certain expectations because of being British and understanding the connection between Britain and America and knowing that it's the dream of every young person of our sort of generations was to go to the States. But you're going you're already number one. So you're going and you've already got, you know, this hit. And I just wondered what the reaction was when you got there, and how surreal was that experience?
Well, just first things first, it was extremely surreal. We played at the Murray the K was the most powerful DJ in America at the time. He introduced himself as the fifth Beatle. I'm not quite sure how the Beatles felt about that, but he was convinced that he was the fifth Beatle. And he would put on a Christmas show and an Easter show, and there would be about 15 acts, as was the tradition in those days. So we had on with us Dionne Warwick, the Shirelles, the Shangri-Las, many wonderful artists. 6 months earlier, we'd been playing, men's soap drinking clubs in St. Albans to 20 people or something like that. Well, maybe it was a little bit better than that, but you sort of get the general picture. And then suddenly we're at the Brooklyn Fox. I'm playing with all these wonderful, brilliant performers. And I have to say, there was a fair amount of trepidation as to how we would be received. But firstly, the other artists were very supportive. And secondly, we opened on Christmas Day. So everyone was, even the Americans, were away from home over Christmas. It went on for 10 days at this theatre. And we played 6 or 7 shows a day. But you only played a couple of songs, and then the next artist came on. But you were there all day. So the Christmas period, we were all there for the whole Christmas period. And then, of course, we had to follow Patti LaBelle, and as was her band at the time, a singing group were called Patti LaBelle and the Bluebells, and they were sensational. They were very beautiful, and also they were wonderful performers, and we had to follow them. And they brought the house down. I have to say that when we were in the wings before we went on, I think there might have been a few knees knocking. But it was great. We went out there and slayed them. It was fantastic. But we had no idea what the reaction was going to be. But it was really, really positive. We got a wonderful reaction.
When you came back, and I've when I did the research, I sort of read this, and I'd forgotten that record companies did that. They used to pump out singles one after the other, and when you and it seems such a weird thing to do. But when you came back, and being young and being under this pressure of regurgitating the next hit and then the next song and then the next song and so on. How did you feel being on this conveyor belt at that time?
Well, I didn't mind it. I don't think any of us minded it that much physically because we were very young. It was very full on. But to me, it seems so sort of self-defeating if you keep insisting on bands having a single. It was every 6 weeks they wanted a single. But of course, we were on the road. And we, especially the main writers, Rod Argent and Chris White, were supposed to be writing hit songs while we were traveling hundreds, maybe thousands of miles to gigs. And of course, it invites you to have a miss or whatever you want to call it, a record that doesn't chart. And then, of course, they all desert you. It doesn't make sense. She's not there. They forced a follow-up out. Well, first of all, they put out an EP which used all the good material we got. So that's gone. So now, we're sort of 4 weeks into our career, and we've used up 6 really good tracks, the A side and the B side, and 4 tracks on the EP. And then they said, now we need a single. And Rod didn't have any songs, and Chris White had one, and none of us thought it was a single, including Chris White. But that's all we had. And they put a lot of pressure on us. And this is, you were asking me earlier on about if we were more experienced, would we have done things in a different way? Well, this is an example. I think if we're more experienced, we would have said, well, we don't have an A-side and you'll have to wait. But we were pressured into putting a song out. It's an okay song, but it's just not a commercial single. It's called Leave Me Be, I think. And of course, it didn't chart. And everybody lost interest. It's in the UK. In America, She's Not There was hit slightly later. It was 3 months later. So they skipped that follow-up, Leave Me Be, and put out the next record, which was Tell Her No. And that was another top 5 single. So probably that's why we've always fared better in America than we did here. A lot of people think of us as a one-hit wonder in the UK. But of course, since Rod and I got back together again in 1999, and we've built the name of the Zombies back up again by constantly touring. We now play major venues all around the world without having a hit single. It's just word of mouth that this band is worth seeing. And so the business is very different now. I don't pretend to understand it. I didn't understand it then, and I don't understand it now. So for me, nothing's changed. But I am aware, actually, on another level, that everything's changed.
Yeah, I mean, it's really fascinating because by the time your second album came about, you'd already left Decca, and then you go into Abbey Road Studios, and
yes,
you record Odessey and Oracle. Odessey misspelt, which is quite fascinating as well. So you record this album. You haven't personally got any money, is what you mentioned earlier, but also there isn't much money. for the recording, but by not having much money, did it enable you to be more creative in the studio? Because this album was a sleeper in the end, wasn't it? It was something that
It
eventually got the
was. I mean,
kudos that it deserved.
it's funny. I mean, Rolling Stone has named this as one of the top 100 albums of all time. And over the years, it's sold truckloads. But not sure it's ever been a hit album. And it's quite unusual for an album that's so high in the Rolling Stone charts like that. If you look, I mean, now it's slipped down to, they've done one more recently, with sort of 200 and something now, but a few years ago, it was in the top 100. And if you look at the songs around it, it'll be the Beatles and Dylan and Simon and Garfunkel and things like that, who all had huge albums. This one wasn't really a big hit album. It got into Billboard I looked it up. It was in Billboard at number 98 for 1 week. But over a long period of time, it has sold a lot of records. So it's a very strange story. But going back to what you said, did it having a small budget? What that did, it made us focus on our opportunity in Abbey Road, so that we rehearsed really strenuously before we went into the studio. We knew the songs we were going to record. We knew the arrangements. We knew the keys. We're just looking for a performance. And that's what we did. It was, I suppose it was quite pressured, but because we knew one another very well, it was a friendly pressure, if you like. We knew we'd just got to get on with it. It didn't mean we didn't have conversations and mess about a bit. We're still young lads at that time, but we knew we'd got to get on with it and get it done. And we just did it, for the budget, for £1,000. And I mean, Abbey Road, even then, was a very expensive studio. How we ever got in there, I don't know, because up to that point, it was called EMI Studios. It's more recently it's been called Abbey Road, and it was called EMI Studios for a good reason. Only EMI artists recorded there, and we were on CBS. I have no idea how we got in there in the first place, but at the time, it was way and above the best studio in London, maybe in the world. We got into Studio 3. The Beatles usually recorded in Studio 2, although they did sometimes record in Studio 3. And we recorded with Peter Vince and Geoff Emerick, who both worked with the Beatles, particularly Geoff Emerick. And they were wonderful producers. And it was a magical experience. It was comparatively easy. They made it easy for us.
I mean, your story takes twist after twist, and there's another twist when you're, in a sense, you've left the music business. You're working as an insurance clerk to make some money, which I believe must have felt really tough if you're a recognizable person and, in a sense, having to do a job like that must have been quite difficult. And then Time of the Season becomes a hit in America. And suddenly this sort of emblematic hit of the psychedelic era resurrects you in a way, doesn't it?
I know. Music business keeps you on your toes, I can tell you. I didn't mind so much being an insurance clerk, and that's what I was. People often say, you were selling insurance? I didn't know anything about insurance. How could I know about insurance to sell it to people? I was the junior clerk in a section in a big insurance company. But one of the good things was it was very, very busy. So I didn't have time to dwell on the sadness of the band finishing. It was for me at that time, it was tragic that the band had finished. But I got into this office and the phones were ringing off the hook. And I didn't have time to dwell on it at all. And then I started getting messages that Time of the Season, because it went up the charts quite slowly, kind of fought its way up on its own. I don't think there was a great deal of money, marketing or promotion went behind that. I mean, there's many stories about that single also, that it really nearly didn't happen. But it started going up the charts. And then I got a phone call from Mike Hurst, who just recorded the early Cat Stevens tracks, Matthew and Son, Gonna Get Me a Gun, and I Love My Dog. 3 really fabulous singles. And Mike Hurst said to me, look, I'd really like to record you. But I wasn't sure I wanted to get back into the music business because I'd just been through drama of the Zombies ending. And he said, well, look, I'll put some tracks together at Olympic Studios and you come along at the end of the day when you've finished with your insurance and we'll put vocals on. And that's what we did. And then for some reason, I mean, I don't quite know why, but we re-recorded She's Not There, I guess because it's a really good song. And I didn't really object because I wasn't even sure that this would ever be released. This was me just dipping my toe in the pool of the music business again. And so I wasn't particularly vocal about what tracks we were going to do. And we ended up doing She's Not There very, very differently. And it was suggested I change my name. And I really don't know why. And again, it was quite arbitrary. I was going to be James MacArthur right up till the time the record was released. And they discovered there was a James MacArthur actor in Hawaii Five-0. So they said, well, you can't be James MacArthur. You've got to be Neil MacArthur. But again, I didn't know that this was going to be the start of a new career. Going back again, hindsight's a wonderful thing. And so under the name of Neil MacArthur, She's Not There was released again. And it was a hit again. Not a big hit, but it was a hit. And I was back in the music business.
I mean, what's interesting is that because this is the year of 1 year as well, that first album, the first solo album. And this was an album where you'd written 4 songs. Now, I don't know if you'd written songs before.
I wrote 2 songs for the Zombies. The Neil MacArthur episode, there were 3 singles, and the first one was a hit, and then the other 2 weren't. And it seemed as though enthusiasm was dwindling for poor old Neil. And I was coming home from a party with Chris White, the original bass player in the Zombies. And Chris said to me, listen, why don't you drop the Neil MacArthur, use your proper name, and come and record with Rod and I. We've got a production company. We'd like to produce you. And it just seemed like a wonderful opportunity now that I was back in the music business to be working with Rod and Chris again. We went back to Abbey Road, Studio 3. Peter Vince was engineering. So the old team was back together again. It was a great way for me to really start my solo career because I knew everyone and I knew the studio. And so it was a very relaxed and supportive environment when we started 1 year. In fact, thinking about it, we did actually try a couple of tracks at another studio before we got the opportunity to go back to Abbey Road. And I was very relieved that we did. And very early on, we were introduced to this wonderful string arranger called Chris Gunning. And we'd recorded, the second thing we recorded for the album was called Misty Roses. It's a beautiful Tim Hardin song. And when we'd recorded it, we realized, I can't give the exact length of the track, but it was very short. It was probably under 2 minutes. And we thought, well, we need to make this track longer. And we gave that to Chris Gunning. And I think maybe from Rod, there was an instruction to think Bartok to left field. We don't want Mantovani. We want something quite unusual. And Chris Gunning came back with a sort of a 2.5 minute instrumental section that was very Bartok-esque. I wasn't expecting it at all, but I absolutely loved it. And then he carried on after the instrumental section. There's a verse, a middle eight, and a verse with me singing over this wonderful but quite avant-garde string arrangement. And I did wonder if I would be able to do it, but you set your mind to it and put the hours in, and it was fine. And so we discovered early on that my voice and strings work well. And later in the album, we recorded 6 tracks like that. And the 6th one, the last one, was a Denny Laine song called Say You Don't Mind. We'd already tried that as a rock song. The Zombies used to close their live show on Denny Laine's version of Say You Don't Mind. So we already knew the song, knew it well. But it hadn't worked as a rock song. We thought, I wonder what Chris Gunning would make of this. And he arranged it for a 21-piece string orchestra. It's quite impressive when they all come in, and a wonderful sound. And again, I wasn't expecting anything like that. put my vocal on it. And the thought never crossed my mind that that would ever be a single, not in a million years. And then when it was chosen as a single, again, don't ask me to be an A&R man because I never know what's going to be a hit. I again was surprised it was chosen as a single, and I didn't think it would be a hit. Definitely not. And it was played off the air, and it was a big hit. And once again, I was off and running as a solo artist.
I mean, Neil Tennant from the Pet Shop Boys has talked about this album as being, one of the most romantic albums ever made. And the 4 songs that you wrote, and you're going to be playing this whole album live, I should say as well. But
absolutely.
The 4 songs that you wrote: Caroline Goodbye, it's about an ex-girlfriend, I believe. Though You Are Far Away, I Can't Live Without You. We're getting really romantic here. Let Me Come Close to You. Now, were you totally inspired by this breakup, by this relationship, being, a young man who experiences love and then it sort of explodes in lyrics and song?
Well, they're not all about the same person, but 3 of those songs are along that line. But I think most people will say that when they write songs, you get triggers. And so this relationship might trigger the idea of a song, but it doesn't necessarily have to be line by line about what happened. It's just a way into the song. And that's what happened. I should hasten to add that I was sharing a flat at the time with a wonderful singer-songwriter called Duncan Browne. If you ever get the chance to look him up, he recorded some fantastic albums, and he was a very good classical guitarist, but a wonderful songwriter as well. And he really inspired me and encouraged me to write. I used to watch him and how he put a song together, and it really inspired me to try and do it myself. So initially I was inspired by Rod and Chris when we were in the Zombies, and then later on there's this singer-songwriter Duncan Browne who was just such a fabulous guitarist. And I think that's when I really decided I wanted to be a writer as well as a singer.
I mean, when you play this gig and you play all the songs from that album, I mean, you're obviously, to every song there is a connection. You're connected to a song. Everyone is, emotionally connected to a song. I remember a particular time. When you play a whole album, the connection must be even stronger. So how do you feel on stage when you do that, and how will you feel on stage doing that?
Well, of course, we've already done this with Odessey and Oracle. We toured for many years, off and on, with the original band playing Odessey and Oracle, and it's a very emotional feeling. It takes you back. I mean, and on 1 year, especially because I wrote so many of the songs, I'll be living that experience in a very vivid way, I think. And probably come off the stage in tatters, particularly on the first night, which is at Harpenden, the Eric Morecambe Centre in Harpenden. And I think it's November the 8th, I think. It's a Friday. And I'm sure I'm going to be in pieces at the end of it. But I think it'll be a very emotional experience, but I think it'll be a wonderful experience too. I mean, that's what it's about, isn't it? Artists should have an emotional experience while they're performing. And of course, you hope that if you're having an emotional experience, that the audience is going to be having an emotional experience too. And I think that's why we do it, really.
I mean, Rod Argent, I just want to ask you this as a final question, because he's played a significant role in your life, as you have in his. But I just wondered what you feel Rod has learned from you as a human being over all these years.
Well, he's probably learned that watching me, someone with very little musical knowledge, if they've got lots of stamina and a bit of front, they can achieve a certain amount of success. I would think it's something like that, really.
No. Well, I want to say from my part, I mean, I'm extremely grateful that your contribution to pop culture over all these years has been so immense, with your wonderful voice and your wonderful talent. So, Colin Blunstone, I really want to thank you from the bottom of my heart. Thank you.
Bob, Thank you so much. It's been great having a chat. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Up there is an interview I recommend. Down there is where you can find all the podcast interviews. And here is where you can connect.